Hello everyone and welcome to Module 2. In this module we'll talk about the process of research more broadly. I call this from lightbulb, from the idea to print, and we'll also talk about applications of research, applying the research and translating that into practice. So in this presentation, I'll give you the big picture of research, and throughout the course of the semester, we'll be going much more in depth into each of these components. So this will give you sort of a big picture sense of how we'll approach research and the steps, and we'll go through each of those over the course of the semester. So the cycle of research involves first having some sort of an idea. So you have research questions, you have an idea, you develop topics, which we'll talk a bit more about today and your book talks more about. You also have to plan and propose the research. So that may be putting together protocols, developing the idea, getting funding. All research has to go through some sort of ethical review, whether that's at a university or community-based organization. And then after all of this, you still have to conduct the research. So we'll talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of that. And then finally, I have this in one step, but this is typically a much more involved process than in one step. We do data analysis, interpret those data and those results, and then disseminate the results. And ideally, we're also applying these results, right? We're applying them to some sort of issue or problem. We're trying to change our practice. We're trying to change educational practices, etc. So though these are big steps in the research cycle, we'll break up each of these steps and talk about them in turn. So first we'll talk about research ideas and questions and development of those. Your book talks a bit about choosing a research topic, some of the nuts and bolts in that, so I won't spend a ton of time on that in the lecture. I'll let you read about that. But to give a small overview, a brief overview, topic ideas usually stem from some sort of interest, so developed via maybe your professional work, your personal experiences. I will give somewhat of a warning about developing research ideas and pursuing research ideas based entirely on your personal experience. There are some topics that are perhaps better saved for therapy, for example. And if you're pursuing a topic that is of specific personal interest because it's happened to you, because it's something you're going through, that may make it a little bit more difficult to actually do that research. Every single time you're opening up that project, you're interviewing people, etc., you may be dredging up a lot of personal stuff. So research is already difficult enough in a lot of ways, and so I would say use some caution in developing ideas that are based entirely on personal experiences. Having said that, you definitely want to pursue an interest or a topic that is going to keep you motivated and keep you interested. So balance those two needs a bit as you develop research ideas moving forward in your career. Another way in which we develop research topics and ideas is that we're addressing an important public health issue, behavioral health issue, something in practice, education, etc. For those of us who do funded research or who depend on funders to pay for our research, some of our research ideas may be motivated by funding priorities. So a particular agency may put out a request for proposals, an RFP, and so they may say, we're interested in conducting research on pregnancy prevention among adolescent girls. And so you may say, great, I'm going to pursue pregnancy prevention in adolescent girls. And so while that may be interesting to you and you may be able to find a smaller sort of component of that broader topic that is particularly interesting to you, some of that may be motivated entirely by the funding priorities. It may also be motivated, and we'll come back to this as we think about the research cycle more broadly, by previous research that you've conducted. So you did a study and you come out of it, and often you come out of it, hopefully you come out of research with some sort of conclusion or an answer to the questions that you posed. But you almost always come out of research with more questions. So your choosing a research topic may actually be part of this cyclical process. Your topic also stems to some degree and depends to some degree on practical issues. So what are your expertise? What kind of support do you have? What's the cost of conducting that research? Are there ethical or research design considerations? And so your topic ideas may not develop from those, but certainly depend on those as you move forward. And we'll talk a bit about literature. Your book talks about academic literature a bit more, but I would encourage you to also read popular literature. So New York Times articles, books that are written for popular audiences. There's a newer book out called Too Hot to Handle, A Global History of Sex Education. Or if you're interested in HIV research, going back and reading some of the popular literature like In the Band Played On, etc. So those kinds of books are often not our primary sources that we're using, but they definitely can help us to develop ideas and to think about how other people are thinking about these things. And then finally, academic literature in terms of developing research ideas. Your book notes this, and I completely agree with this, to start with literature reviews and meta-analyses. These are going to give you a broad sense of what we know, the controversies in the field, the methodologies, and both reviews and meta-analyses, as well as empirical reports of individual studies, will help us identify the next steps in the research, gaps in the literature, and we'll talk a bit more about that as we go into the Lit Review module next week. So one other note about developing a research topic is that these topics should end up being fairly narrow and of some value, ideally, in practice and or in the research conversation. So does this topic contribute to the conversation that we're having? Does it help us to think about how we design education, how we conduct our own practices, etc. So your book talks a little bit more about this, and we'll talk more about utilizing the literature to conduct a literature review to get a sense of the literature in Module 3. So coming back to the cycle, let's assume we have developed some sort of research idea, question, we've reviewed the literature, and we want to move forward and plan and propose our research. So there are many components to planning and proposing our research. The first is choosing some sort of a research design, which depends first and foremost on our research question, and also on ethical considerations. What can we actually do to people? We are researchers, we are clinicians, we're educators, we are not reality television producers, so we certainly have limits on what we can do. There are obviously also tremendous financial considerations. So while we would like to bring people in and interview them for hours upon hours and have them fill out every known measure related to sexuality, we would have to pay them a lot of money to do that, ideally. And so there are financial considerations in what we can and can't do. And also practical considerations. How much time do we have? What kinds of materials can we get? What kind of space do we have to conduct the research, etc.? So your book talks a little bit about the qualitative and quantitative debate, and I appreciate a lot of what your book says about this debate. I'll note a couple of ways in which I not disagree, but would have something more to say than what your book says. So your book talks about qualitative research taking a lot more time than quantitative research. This can certainly be true. I think both do take time, so I don't want people to think of quantitative research as quick and easy to do. I just created a survey recently, and it took my colleague and I over a year to develop the survey, to choose the measures, to refine it, to have people test it out, and to actually put it together. And so obviously we weren't working on that full time for either of us. But I think it's important to not think that quantitative research is just going to be a quick and easy way to do research. Both of these methodologies take time, and both should have really well-defined procedures that may need to change over the course of the research. Your book talks about quantitative research as being set in stone, your measures are all set, and that, typically is true and ideally is true so that you have enough data to analyze and that you've been consistent over time. But there are certainly ways in which you look at the data as you're collecting it and realize, oh, wow, that's not working. We're not getting any variability in this measure. People don't understand this question. We're going to need to change something. And we'll lose the data that we collected before, and that's just the way that it is. But hopefully we can salvage enough to move forward and have a better answer to our question by modifying that. Both involve researcher design questions and materials. So in qualitative research, we're often writing questions and making sure that those questions are open-ended, are giving people the opportunity to provide the kinds of answers that we want, while also preserving their voice in that process. And in quantitative research, we're also designing questions. So we may be choosing scales, we may be designing our own questions, we're putting together the order of those questions, we're putting together instructions, and so we're certainly interacting with participants in the collection of both kinds of data. The ways in which we ask questions, the ways in which we word questions, whether that interaction is via computer or in person or some combination of the two. All of research, unless we're doing some secondary data analysis, involves interaction with participants. And each is appropriate to different kinds of questions, which I think your book does a nice job of giving you a sense of. And mixed methods research is a really ideal way to try and get at certain kinds of questions in multiple ways, which I think is really useful. So assuming we have decided on design, choosing measures is also one of the most key pieces of designing and planning a research project. So for sex researchers, this can be a bit more complicated. For some research, it's fairly easy to choose standard measures. So height, weight, time that's passed since a certain event, those are standard metrics that we all know and use. So for us, we have to think a little bit more about how we measure the kinds of things that we're interested in. So I've done a lot of HIV research, and so a lot of what we're trying to measure is perceptions of risk for HIV, HIV risk behavior specifically, and how do we define that? How do participants define that? If we're looking at family structures or emotions, how do we define love? How do we define commitment? How do we define and measure good parenting? And then at its basic core, sex research is often looking at sexual behaviors. So how do we define sexual activity, for example? If we want to say somebody is going to be included in our research if they're sexually active, does that mean that they are sexually active and having vaginal or anal sex? Does that mean that they're having any kind of sexual behavior? How do we define that, and how do we communicate that definition to participants? And we'll talk much more about choosing measures and implementing those measures as we move forward in this semester. We also then want to choose our participants. And obviously each of these components, creating the design, choosing measures, choosing participants, don't necessarily happen in this linear format. We're often thinking of all of these things at the same time and moving back and forth between these thoughts. But we're often choosing participants in somewhat of an order. So we want to choose our population. So adolescent girls, veterans, etc. We choose our population. And then we want to choose the sample. So we want to think about whether or not it's important to us that that sample is generalizable to the broader population. So if we are thinking about adolescent girls, we want to be able to say that our sample of adolescent girls is similar to or generalizable to the entire universe of adolescent girls or the entire country worth of adolescent girls. And we also want to think about our inclusion and exclusion criteria. So you will be eligible to be in the study if you are sexually active, as I mentioned in the previous example, and then what that means. We might exclude you for all sorts of reasons. So maybe because you're not sexually active, because you're under the age of 18 and we're only interested in those over 18, but we really want to define what those inclusion and exclusion criteria are. We also have to think about the sample size that we need to be able to run the kinds of analyses that we're interested in, to be able to have enough statistical power to detect an effect. And we'll talk more about what that means, both practically and mathematically, as we move forward in the semester and talk about data analysis. We also want to determine the appropriate sampling techniques. So do we need something that is probability-based? Do we need something that's non-probability-based? And there are a tremendous range of sampling techniques. These are a few here. You don't have to worry about knowing these or naming these or anything. Just some that I have some familiarity with. And so there's a lot to think about in what sampling technique you'll use and why you use that. As I mentioned in Module 1, we're often making research decisions to which there are not necessarily right or wrong answers, but to which we want to make sure that we can justify our decisions. So sampling is certainly one of those when we want to be able to say, we could have chosen a range of options and here's what we chose and why. We also have to think a little bit about potentially retaining our sample if we're doing longitudinal work, if we're going to lose participants from one assessment to another, from one time point to another. And we always have to think in sex research in particular about volunteer bias. So there's research indicating that people who participate in sex research tend to be more liberal sexually, more comfortable with thinking about sexuality, lower in sexual guilt than people who don't participate in sex research. And so we know that there is some volunteer bias in sex research. And so we may just have to think about how that might play out for our sample, how we might pitch our research to people to try and minimize that volunteer bias. But certainly something that we should always keep in mind, even if we can't 100% avoid it. So for many of us, we need to fund our research. So we need to get money to do the research so we can pay participants incentives or buy them some incentives in some form. We may need to pay staff. We may need to buy specific supplies to actually conduct the research, whether those are computers or some people charge for survey instruments, which I loathe, but that's another story. And we also, for those of us who are in research positions at universities, tenure-track faculty positions, universities love money. For most research funding that you get some money that's given directly to you through the university to do the research. But for a lot of funding institutions, the National Institutes of Health in particular, the universities also get what's called an indirect cut of that money. And so the NIH will give, let's say you get an award for $150,000, and the NIH will give the university $150,000 that's then funneled to you. But the university will also get a cut of that money, and different organizations have a different rate at which they provide an indirect support. And so the universities get that money because they are housing you, because they are paying for the phone lines, because they are often paying for mailing services, etc. And so universities are already doing that, but this is a little bit more support for them to do that. And universities are always looking for money. And so bringing in research funding, particularly in a university setting, which is what I can speak to in my experience, is something that is looked upon very favorably. Getting money to do your research can also ease other responsibilities, whether those are clinical responsibilities or teaching responsibilities. They can ease some of those responsibilities. Often you'll hear faculty members talking about buying out of courses, which means that if you get some research money, you can pay for an adjunct to teach your course, which gives you more time to do the research. So that can be a key piece of getting some research funding as well. And I will say that getting research funding requires a lot of patience and a tremendously thick skin to be able to deal with the rejection that's involved in that. For example, I just finished conducting some research on the connection between alcohol and sexual behavior, and that was funded by the National Institutes of Health. I started putting in, my colleagues and I started putting in the application to get funding for that project in 2007. The project was eventually funded in late 2010, so it took us 3 years to get that funding, and then 5 years to conduct the actual research. It was a longitudinal study, and so now we are roughly 8 years past the time that I had the original idea to do this research. So we're looking at close to a decade between question and answer. That is somewhat atypical for most of you if you have smaller projects, more contained research questions. This was certainly a multi-million-dollar funded study, but for a lot of us, we're going to be doing much smaller projects. So I don't want to make that sound like every project is going to take you a decade. Probably most of us would not do research if that were the case. And so, as you've noticed probably, I talk a lot about we as I mention research. And research doesn't and shouldn't occur in a vacuum. It's important for us to build the appropriate collaborations early, whether those are with community organizations, community key people, stakeholders, things like that, with colleagues. Throughout, we should really be clear about the roles and responsibilities. So what do you expect from people? What will their title or their role be in this research? And be very clear and upfront about that. It's much better to have those difficult conversations early on in the process than to have incredibly difficult conversations later on in the process. And be collaborative. This is something I say in all of my lectures. Just don't be a jerk. Be willing to share credit when credit is due. I am a big fan of being generous with that credit, particularly with students. So being collaborative in your work is going to take you very far in the research world. And we also want to think about whether it's appropriate for us to partner with organizations, community stakeholders, or if we want to stick with academic colleagues. So thinking about creating those partnerships and creating mutually beneficial partnerships is really key. Your book talks a little bit about community-based participatory research and participatory action research. And so those are really key in thinking about how to create those partnerships and what those should look like. So let's say we have a great idea, we've developed that, we've planned the research, we've pulled everything together in terms of what we're going to do and planned our research. The next step will be getting IRB review, Institutional Review Board approval, and actually conducting the research. So we'll talk much more about the ethics of research and of sex research specifically as we move forward. The basic ideas of ethics in regards to research are the principles of beneficence, fidelity, and responsibility, integrity, justice, and maintaining respect for people's rights and dignity. And we'll break those down as we move forward. So there are a lot of practical things that we have to think about as we move forward in planning a research study. So one of the primary things is confidentiality. And so confidentiality obviously pertains to the conversations that we have, how we talk about the data that we're collecting, the participants. But we also have to think about how we're going to store data, how we're going to present data, how we're going to contact participants. So if we go out into the world and say, hey, all these people, I have a research study, then you should be a part of it if you are interested. So if you're HIV positive and not taking your medications as prescribed, you should write your name on this piece of paper and we'll get in touch with you to find out if you're eligible. And now we have a piece of paper or a data file or however we've collected that data with a list of people who are HIV positive. That is something we have to hold in tremendous confidentiality. And depending on where we are, there may be a whole host of regulations around that, HIPAA regulations, et cetera. So we have to think about the logistics of how we're going to do that. How will we keep that data confidential? How will we store it? And then how will we make that contact with participants? So if we call their house and leave a message and we say, I'm with Project Adhere. And let's say we leave a message and their daughter hears the message and says, what's Project Adhere? And looks it up and says, oh, it's for people who are HIV positive. I didn't know my mom was HIV positive. Why are they calling her? Does she have HIV? So we have to think about really small decisions in contacting participants. We have to be able to obtain consent or assent to participate in the study. So we have to be able to explain the study in a way that people can understand and can take that information and make an informed decision about whether or not they'd like to participate. And we have to make sure that we are engaging with people in culturally competent ways. So our assessment materials, getting a good sense of their experience and representing their experience culturally in an appropriate way. Are we interacting with people in appropriate ways? And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward in the semester as well. And basically, we have to ensure safety and avoid harm. So we have to make sure that the questions that we're asking, the protocols that we're putting people through are not making things worse. And there's been a lot of concern in sexuality research that even just asking people about their sexuality maybe is harmful. And luckily, we've had some pretty good research indicating that people tend to hold their own and be okay when we ask them about sexuality. But this may not be true for everybody. And so we have to make sure that we have plans in place to be able to avoid harm. And so that may be having appropriate referrals for people who have experienced sexual assault, and now talking about their experiences of sexual assault has triggered some emotional response in them. And so we need to be able to say, you know, obviously we're not necessarily in the business of providing that care ourselves. We're in the business of research for these purposes at least. And so can we give them referrals? Can we make sure that we can keep them safe in that moment? And then once we have planned all of the research out and laid out plans to keep people safe and avoid harm, we have to put that through an institutional review board and get them to approve the research and to let us move forward in that. And typically approval happens from year to year. So if the project is a multi-year project, you have to go in every year and say, here's what we're doing, still the same, we've changed this, we've changed that, here's how many people have participated, here's been their reaction, etc. And that can often be a very long process in and of itself. So we've had an idea, we've planned it out, we've gotten it approved by the Institutional Review Board, and now we have to make it happen. So we have to create protocols, materials, so maybe those are surveys, interview guides, other kinds of materials. We have to design those, we have to test them ideally, and make sure, especially if they're new materials or new surveys, that they actually do what we are hoping they will do. We need to create protocols, specifically if we have complex designs or complex assessments. We want to make sure that anybody who is conducting that research is following the same protocol every single time. So for a lot of my research, what I've done is created a checklist that is a detailed step-by-step move through the research assessment itself. For those of you who may be conducting research, or those of us who may be conducting research in which we're training a staff of people to conduct that research, we have to train the staff initially and ongoing and make sure that we're reviewing their work, that they're maintaining fidelity to the protocol. And ideally, as I mentioned before, we would pilot test everything and actually make sure everything works with a very small subset of participants, and then make any changes that we need to make based on the feedback and our experiences with utilizing the protocols and the measures as we've laid them out. Then we actually have to recruit people. We have to enroll them in the study, and if the study is longitudinal, we have to keep them in the study. So we may have to create recruitment materials and methods. It's amazing how much time researchers will spend on this process to create an image and a tagline that will hopefully draw people into research and make them call and see if they're eligible and feel good about participating in the research. I will often say in research that one of the most difficult parts is getting people through the front door. Getting live bodies to actually participate in your research is tremendously challenging. And then we have to conduct the assessments. The one thing I will say about this at this stage is that happy participants create better data and retention, and good retention if we're trying to keep those people longitudinally. And how we ask the questions is just as important as what we ask, how we respond to people. So let's say we're doing a qualitative study. We've laid out a great interview guide with open-ended questions. And if we ask them in a way that conveys some level of judgment or some kind of an opinion about the question or the answer, then we've kind of ruined our question in some ways. So conducting these assessments, even after we've designed them in the best way possible, how we conduct them is still incredibly critical. If we're doing a longitudinal study, we have to think about how to keep track of participants, how to get them back in the door, how to maintain the data in a way that is confidential and also allows us to keep track of people. We have to create data sets, so that's about data entry and making sure the data has been entered correctly, or transferring the data from a survey, for example, transcription. And then how we'll store those data, how we'll keep them confidential and safe, how long we need to store them. There are often IRB requirements or funding requirements about how long the data are kept or maintained. And so we have developed our idea, we've planned our research, we've actually conducted it with ongoing ethical approval. And now we need to do this incredibly important step where we analyze and interpret the data and ideally disseminate and apply the results. And again, as I mentioned, this is multiple steps, but we'll include it in one big umbrella for the purposes of our conversation right now. So as we are analyzing the data, for many of the questions that we'll pose, we've determined the appropriate analyses for the research questions prior to this stage. For many large projects in which there are multiple questions, we'll typically need to think every time about determining the appropriate analyses for our questions. We want to report our findings in a way that is parsimonious, that is aesthetically pleasing if we're talking about tables and charts and graphs, and we'll want to interpret those findings in a way that is true to what the findings actually say. And we want to draw conclusions, and that's where a little bit more creativity comes into play here in actually telling the reader what your findings mean and answering the so what question. So here's what we think they mean, and here's why you should care. We'll talk more about this as we go through the semester as well, but presenting your research, in my opinion, is incredibly important. So for many of us, presenting research means presenting research at professional meetings, so whether that's posters or oral presentations, and we can talk more about what those look like if people are interested, but we want to present research to disseminate our work. So we've done all of this work. We've asked a lot of our participants to share their experiences with us. And so we want to make sure that we disseminate that work, that we tell other providers, that we tell other researchers what we found. We also want to build a reputation for ourselves as researchers. And we want to develop collaborations and research networks, so being able to present our work is a great way to develop those collaborations and to develop those research networks. We also want to get feedback. So somebody may say to us, have you thought about this? This is a really interesting point. You should look at this literature that will give you a better sense of how to interpret that. Have you thought about doing it this way? And so, as I mentioned before, research does not occur in a vacuum. And so this is one of the ways in which you can get some feedback and get some collaborative components to your research. And also for professional development. So for those of you who are interested in going into research as more a part of your career, these presentations will go on your CV or on your resume. And so you want to be able to demonstrate that you have developed work that has been accepted for presentation or accepted for publication, and that you've actually been able to follow through and do that. And regardless of what your career path will be, presentation skills are tremendously important. So as you move forward and present research, specifically in-person presentations, practice that as much as you can. That will serve you well in any career path that you move forward in. And so thinking about publication, for some of you, this may be something that you're not necessarily interested in as you move forward. But for those of us who have pursued academic careers or who want to pursue academic careers, there is a saying in the academic world that is publish or perish. And some of you may have heard this. Publish or perish means that you have to publish academic articles, peer-reviewed articles, or you will lose your job or not get tenure. And so these peer-reviewed publications are the currency of academia and research. Peer review means that we send a paper into a journal, for example, and they will send that manuscript out to usually 2 or 3 different experts in the field. So for example, I review for maybe 10 different journals, and so I'll review typically 1 article a month. It's part of sort of our professional service and paying it forward that we review articles. It's also a really great process to review articles to get a sense of how you're critiquing other research, which makes you better at anticipating how others will critique your research and makes you better at designing and presenting that research. So peer review is the process by which other peers, our peers in the field, our other academics or other researchers review our research and give us feedback on the research. And so we won't talk a ton about this. If you are interested in this moving forward, I'm happy to chat about choosing a journal. This is often dependent on the audience that you're looking at, the kind of articles that the journal publishes, considering the impact that that journal may have. Most journals have what's called an impact factor that is a metric of how often those papers are viewed and cited by others. And for most of us, we want to try and get as much impact as we can. So we want the paper to be seen and utilized by as many people as possible. And in this process, it can be incredibly frustrating to have to integrate feedback. So for most of us, we submit a paper and we'll get 3 different reviews of it. And those reviews may be anywhere from 1 to 3 pages long of bullet points of things that they want you to change about the manuscript, analyses, more information, less information, different kinds of presentation. So it's taken often so long to get to the point where you have a draft of a manuscript that you're ready to send to a journal. And then integrating a tremendous amount of feedback can be incredibly daunting and frustrating. And so I'm happy to chat more about that if people have individual questions about that process. And much as with funding, we have to be able to accept rejection. We have to be able to accept that papers just sometimes don't get in. And you never know why that is. It might not match the journal. You might have gotten a finicky reviewer who just doesn't like you, doesn't like your idea. Most reviews are blind, but not all journals do blind reviews. So in some journals, the reviewers will actually know who you are. And so being able to accept that rejection is a key piece of being in academia. And it can be incredibly frustrating, especially if you're particularly enamored of an idea or a paper. So a lot of researchers will stop there. They'll say, great, I got a publication, it's on my CV. That helps me moving forward to get more funding, to do more research, to write more papers. Fantastic. For most of us, though, we want to actually see that research do some good in the world. And so we want to be able to apply this research to the real world. So this is a process that some people call translational research, in which we try and test interventions in applied settings. So we've developed an intervention that we tested in the lab, and it was great. But now we need to see how it works in an actual setting. So hospitals, clinics, schools, etc. We want to be able to integrate research into our therapeutic practice or into educational settings. And throughout that process, we want to be able to make sure that people, practitioners, educators, whatever, are maintaining fidelity to the protocol as we've laid it out. And we have to understand the critical components of whatever practice that we're doing, whatever intervention that we're doing, to be able to say, this is the piece that you can't change. You have to do it just like this, or you have to maintain this idea conceptually. And as we're doing this research and translational research to see if interventions, for example, or educational or therapeutic practices work in real life settings, we also have to think about the appropriate outcomes. So are we interested in behavior, in knowledge, in perceptions of risk, things like that. So we have to identify the critical components and the appropriate outcomes to assess the efficacy of that intervention or educational or therapeutic practice. We also may want to decide for whom does it work. I've worked on an intervention before that was trying to reduce alcohol consumption and abuse among HIV positive individuals who were not adhering to their HIV medications. And what we found was that the intervention was great if you were a heavy drinker. For those who weren't so heavy of drinkers, the intervention didn't really do anything for them. So you may have to decide and determine for whom does that intervention or practice actually work best. And your book talks a little bit about community-based participatory research and participatory action research. These kinds of research often hold this application or this translation of research to the real world as key components of those research designs and practices. So this is the research process more broadly. Once we go through this process, we often just repeat the process, particularly for those of us who are in research or academic careers in which conducting this research is an ongoing part of our jobs and our worlds. So for most of us, we'll continue this process over and over throughout the course of our career. Another thing that I will say, again, coming off of this collaboration point, is that it takes a village to conduct research. So some research projects have a single person, particularly if you're doing dissertation research or thesis research. You may have just you and an advisor, maybe an undergraduate student who's helping you. But a lot of research projects have anywhere from 5 to 50 or more people working on them over the life of the project, not counting the participants, of course. So it takes a village, really. So the last part that we'll talk about is evaluating research. For most of you, you may not actually be conducting research as you move forward in your careers, but you'll be trying to think about how to integrate research into your practice and how to know what research that you should look at and if it's good research and how you might integrate that. And your book has a checklist of good research and good researchers. So this is somewhat based on that list and also integrating my own thoughts. So as you're reading research articles, as you're looking at presentations of research, you want to be able to say that this research is clearly based on prior literature and theoretical frameworks, that it's not totally being plucked out of the air with complete lack of attention to what other people have done. We often want to say that this research is objective. So is there too much of an individual's opinion or ideas inserted into the research without attention to other alternative ways of thinking about it? Does the research have clearly stated research questions and hypotheses? Are the methods that they utilized appropriate for those questions? And are we able to replicate the research? Are we able to look at the procedure section of a manuscript and be able to redo that research, essentially, or replicate that research with that information that's provided to us? Is the research generalizable, and is that even their point? Can we say that this sample or this way of looking at it is similar to what we would think for, as the example I gave earlier, all adolescent girls in the United States? And what are the limits of generalizability? Is the research accurate? So we'll talk more about validity and reliability. So are we measuring what we think we're measuring? Are we measuring that in a way that will give us consistent results? And we'll talk much more about that as the semester goes on. Are the data analyses conducted rigorous and appropriate data analyses? We'll also talk more about that as we move forward. And are the researchers making appropriate research conclusions? So here's what we found, and now we're making these conclusions. One of the things that I'm often dinged for in my research is thinking too big about the conclusions that I make. And so I've had reviewers say to me, your results are interesting and important, but not nearly as important as you seem to think that they are. So having appropriate conclusions that are consistent with your data and just right in terms of size, so not too big, not too small. So these are some points to consider when evaluating research. I won't talk about the characteristics of a good researcher. I think those are laid out in your book fairly nicely. And we'll end here for Module 2. If you have questions or thoughts, please post them under the general discussion forum, and we can have a conversation about some of these ideas as we move forward. In Module 3, we'll talk about conducting literature reviews, which will also give you a much better sense of how to refine your topic ideas and turn those topic ideas into research questions, which will be the topic of Module 4, is developing questions and hypotheses. So if you have any questions, go ahead and post them, and I'll see you for Module 3.